Hello and welcome to Tonebenders, where we talk with the sonic artists behind our favorite films, games, and series. My name is Tim Muirhead, and I will be your host today as I sit in C5 Studios in New York City. This is really awesome. We get to do the interview today in person. I'm also here with my co-host, Teresa Morrow. Teresa, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm up and at 'em, Tim.
So today we're here to talk to Paul Sue about his work on the recent film, Beau Is Afraid. If you haven't seen this film yet, go check it out right now. I was actually late to the film, but once I saw it, I really wanted to talk to Paul immediately because the work on it, it just gave me a million questions that I have. This film is full of unlimited possibility in a way that most films aren't. There's a common criticism that goes around with the current state of films that all movies are the same, and we've seen it all before. This film has put its foot forward to say that no, you haven't. While watching it, the viewer truly has no idea what is coming next. Paul has been on Tonebenders twice before. He's one of our favorite guests. He has an almost comically long credit list on IMDb. I don't know how he's been able to work on so many interesting projects. Paul, welcome back to Tonebenders. Thanks for welcoming us into your space today.
Of course, good to have you here.
Awesome. So let's talk about Beau Is Afraid. What were your thoughts when you first screened it?
Well, first, to be clear, when I read the script, which was passed to me by my friend Anne Ruark, who's an amazing producer. She pitched it really hard to me and said, "This is the most incredible script I've ever read. You have to work on this movie. I'm going to set up the interview with Ari, and we have to talk about this." So I was prepped in that way, and the script is mind-blowing in itself. But then watching the first cut, which is, of course, rough, literally almost no music, of course, no sound. It's really just production cut, back to back. Yeah, it was relentless and mind-blowing in that state even. And not to mention the VFX, of course, are worth mentioning too, because all the VFX at that point are nearly non-existent. So tons of green screen, tons of, that kind of stuff. But if you have to use your imagination, but still the through line is clearly there at that point. So,
well, something that I find really fascinating in general is the spotting sessions, when you sit down with the director and the producer and do a spotting session. And a lot of time with a spotting session, a car will drive by and they'll say, "We need a sound of a car there." And all the sound people are like, "Yeah, we know. That's not what we're here to talk about."
To quote my partner, Phil Stockton, "See a dog, hear a dog."
Yeah, exactly. But I can imagine the spotting session for this film, because nothing is really what it seems. And your first time through, obviously you had the script to guide you, but how in depth did you go?
Well, that's what's interesting is I don't think, and some of this is just my personal, approach to it, but what I've noticed is that the more experienced or the directors who have a more in-depth approach or just a really nuanced but also extremely extensive view on filmmaking, the less spotting we do. So we don't really spot, we just have endless conversations. And we spend more time doing things together. And there's more back and forth and actual trial and error. And it's almost, there's the directors that I like to work with, there's almost a sort of unspoken, we're testing each other, where I'm waiting to see what they're going to ask for, and they're waiting to see if I have an idea that might either line up with what they already thought, or hopefully even better, surprise or inspire them. So we don't do spotting sessions. We just get into the work. We have this weird esoteric conversation like Ari and I had when we first met over Zoom when he was shooting in Canada. And we just have this conversation about life and maybe a little bit the script and maybe some boring details about production. But we don't go into the concepts so much about how the movie's gonna sound. And for me anyway, it really feels like this sort of, it's a bit like a first date where you're sort of trying to feel the other person out and okay, when they say they like cats, do they really like cats? Or is it because they think I like it? That sort of back and forth, and you're trying to feel the other person out creatively to see if it's gonna be a good fit. And that, for me, that just continues into the work, where we don't sit down and talk about, okay, here we wanna do this. We just sort of just dive in and then try to catch a sort of a wave of how we're going to get to the places we need to get, and just with tons of trial and error, frankly, with a little idea pitches as we go. But yeah, to be honest, I don't really believe in spotting sessions, because because the process is so much more immersive and so much more intense if you just dive in the deep end of the pool and just go for it and start doing stuff. And that's my preference, to do it that way.
There's something about this film though that the through line, well, the through line is clear. It's Beau's story,
Mhm.
but what is it really all about is mysterious
Correct. And
or
to that,
up to interpretation.
well, but and to that point, that's what's funny is Ari and I have never actually fully spoken about this, but that's also an unspoken no-go zone of like I never at no point have I asked him to explain a thing in the movie.
Did you have your own theories or thoughts about
Of course.
which drove
Of
your
course,
concept?
but there was something sacred about if I ask him, well, what does that mean? Who cares? Like it does, and I think we were talking about the Vanity Fair article a second ago. Like
Yeah.
I think he alludes to that a little bit of like he would prefer you to find out. So I'm sure there are scenes in the movie where he would, if I said, oh, I think it's about this, he would be like, are you kidding? Like that's not what the movie's
Don't
about.
ruin it.
Yeah, well, you're just
Or
wrong.
you're
Like that's
wrong,
not.
yeah.
So I left that intentionally alone, and we would sort of skirt the edge slightly, but yeah, we never got into like literal discussions about like, oh, what's happening here. Just more. I just always prefer like the weirder like esoteric space of just like
Right.
because sound is it's more of for me it's more of an emotional reactive environment where it's like it doesn't the people talk a lot about the story of telling the story thing. I'm not into that at all. It's like we're just trying to make the audience feel something,
Yeah.
and as long as narratively it's lining up with what he's trying to do,
Yeah.
who cares if I got it wrong or if
So you're the scene intentions, or you kind of feel like giving it your interpretation.
yeah, of
and
course. Like
seeing how that
I know
flies.
what I think the scene is about.
Yeah.
But why do we have to talk about it? If I do what I do and it somehow in translation adds up to what he wants the audience to feel, then we're good. Then we just that's the goal, right?
You're out there. Yeah.
A recent episode that we did, we got a bunch of people who cut ambiences.
Oh, okay.
And that's something that rarely gets talked about in the sound world. Ambiences, sadly, sometimes just get farmed out to the intern in some places.
Yeah, and it's hard to quantify for an audience member.
But this film rides a really cool line between where is ambience and sound design. Like for instance, really close to the beginning of the film, he's sitting in a quiet room, and the ambiences just keep building and building. We start hearing more horns honking outside, more horns honking, and then it cuts, and the ambiences completely die out. And as a viewer, that's a rare thing to see in a movie, like just the ambiences change. And you're like, did we just jump ahead in time? Like what just, it puts the viewer completely off kilter.
Yeah, exactly. And that's to your earlier question about spotting, even though I don't believe in spotting, Ari's a perfect example of how what I do like to do with a certain type of director is just, we spend a lot, it's a very intimate process. So we don't do the traditional pre-mixing and prep. He comes to the studio and we just start in the first scene. And there's been a little bit of, maybe the sound effects editor or the Foley editor has done some stuff for me, and maybe I've done a little bit of touching the dialogue, but it's not much, right? We're kind of listening to the AAF, right? And we have ideas, and maybe I've recorded things for the scenes or whatever, and then we just start building it together from the very first shot and just work through it. And to your point, those kind of ambience things, those are done in the studio with Ari sitting right next to me. We're just like, he says, well, should we try this? I thought before we were gonna do this other thing. I cut it in, put it in the mix, play the scene, and then we just get into it as if he's a mixer in a way, where it's like he says, well, no, what if we try this other thing? And we just do it together. And so like the first reel of Beau is, it's that it's like an act basically, right? But that first 40 some minutes, that's about 3+ weeks of him coming to the studio every day, and we just start and we work one shot at a time through it, and then do traditional like playbacks and going back and stuff. But mostly it's just working together through it as if he's a sound designer or a mixer, and he's just there with me working on it. So that's how we find those beats, really, just together.
I feel like that's like when we talk to some sound supers or editors, when there's like a conceptual sound thing, like how the ambiences move in this film, they're like, oh, that they did that was picture editor, like that was stuff that was worked out picture edit, and like we just took that idea and elaborated on it. But it sounds like some of those concepts were
done with exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, Luke, the picture editor, was usually there as well.
Mm-hmm.
And to be clear, like if I do guest lectures, I always make a really strong point about that. Like half of the sound design happens in the picture edit, unquestionably. Like that's where those things are generally developed, right? 100%. But then because we specifically talked about working in that way, then Luke and Ari would come to the studio, and we would then they had set certain, you know, placeholders in place, but then they knew, okay, now when we go over to Paul, we're going to really explore. We're going to start tearing things apart, doing much more. You know, so that's a little non-traditional in that way, exactly, where they left it open, and then we would just really start to get into the, you know, to the nitty-gritty from there. So
there's another ambience moment in the film that I love. I'm going to say that it's beauty because of its simplicity, but you're probably going to say that it was not simple at all. But there's about maybe 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the film, there's a very fantastical, when he kind of goes into the play.
Yeah.
And there's animation, and like it's a very different sequence than the rest of the film. And throughout that entire sequence, there's this kind of drone happening. And those kind of sequences, often the hardest thing to do is get out of them.
Yeah. And
the way you get out of it is the drone stops and just the perfect cricket bed comes up.
Yeah.
And it's like it's a creepy cricket bed, but it's like the exact mood shift, and all it is just crickets. And then you're just like, oh shit, something is bad is about to happen. Like these crickets do not mean anything good.
Yeah.
But like it's the simplicity of it. It's just that sound that we all know, crickets. And it works so well.
And that's a good example, actually. The other thing that I'm really a big believer in, which is as the picture edit begins, even like the assembly is happening, is sending sounds to the picture assistant and the picture editor to work with. And that's how the drone came about. Like I would make sounds and then send them over there, and they would cut them in, and then they find, to your point earlier, they find the placeholders of, you know, what's working, and then how much can we sustain that. And the thing that's very, if you go back and listen to that section, the other thing that's the really subversive part of it that I'm actually a big fan of is there's connected to that drone, there's also the sound of Joaquin breathing through the entire section. So he's there as the person on screen, but he also did a complete take in the ADR studio where he just watched it and was just quietly breathing as if he was observing himself. And so that's actually connected to the drone, and that's what it also cuts out at the moment when we see him on camera in you know, quote, real life, and the crickets come up and he's now there with his, like, you know, his children, quote unquote. And so that's a big part of the connection of the drone to which when it's taken out, it leaves that void for the, you know, the crickets.
Exactly.
To come in.
Let's talk about ADR in this film. What's your approach to dealing with the actors? How do you get the best out of someone on the ADR stage?
The good actors they're really, it's a part of their, a picture editor friend of mine he refers to it as having control over their instrument, right? If their voice and their body is their instrument, right?
And their ego.
There's that too, yeah. Exactly. But specifically, like imagine if you're like a sax player, and you instead of a sax, you have your voice, right? And you carry some emotion through that. Some screen actors, you know, in my opinion, a lot of their what we love about them is we just like to look at them, and the feeling of them being on screen is what gives them great value and what makes them really interesting. And then stage actors have this ability to, like, you know, consistently emote in certain ways. ADR is this weird sort of in between, and not taking anything away from great actors who are not good at ADR, but to me, the skill of being able to control your instrument, to be able to just instantly turn something on, to take the viewer to a place by emitting something, that's a specific skill. And I think some actors just aren't as good at it, you know. And actually, I have an example actually in this movie. The girl who plays Tony, Kylie Rogers, I think she's 18. She's 17, 18, 19, maybe, right, at the time of shooting, and she was incredible. The paint drinking scene in the movie, she came in and she did ADR. There's only like 3 lines in that scene, but she came in and she did ADR, and we did when she's gurgling the paint. Ari wanted her to do a little extra, so the intern went to the store and bought some yogurt, and she was in the studio right next door here, and she just basically ingested half a quart of yogurt and almost, I mean, she almost passed out. Like she was 100% committed and just killed it. Like really did it, you know, and Kylie was incredible, but Joaquin is maybe one of the, I don't think I've ever witnessed that level of like ADR ability. Like,
wow.
And to me, it's not just being, because I like to do ADR with actors just on the stage, not without beeps and headphones and all that stuff, right? But he did his ADR in LA in a traditional setting. But the way I can always tell is when you go to mix the ADR into the final. And the better they are, the less you have to do. And there's a point at which you have to do absolutely nothing. And that's Joaquin. Like you take the first take, you put it up, and you listen to it and you realize, oh, that's actually perfect. It sounds exactly like the piece of production right before it. And that's not a technical thing.
Yeah.
That's because he's brought himself right back to the exact same place where he was the moment that he shot that scene, and it just matches.
Wow.
And to me, that's the ultimate litmus test. It just works. And why does it work? Because he's brought it right back to that place, you know,
So there's a couple sound moments in the film. Well, there's many sound moments in the film, but a couple that I wanted to talk about. One, I'm a sound editor myself, and there's a scene in the movie where he's in a boat, and the engine of the boat starts malfunctioning.
Mm-hmm.
This is the kind of sound that I have so much trouble with when I'm trying to do this kind of thing, because it has to be super interesting, it has to be distinctive, but it also has to continue on for a long time while dialogue's going on. It has to be able to pop in and out, and it can't sound repetitive.
Yep.
How do you go about tackling that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, I think in a more traditional action movie, we would replace the whole thing with like a multi-miking situation where you have a mic that's closer to the engine itself, one that's a little more ambient, so that you have some range to like let the sound change over time, and then you can control things more. In this case, because Ari has very sort of rigorous, like, you know, more what's the word? I don't want to say indie per se, but non like Hollywoodish, you know, tendencies in terms of like how he wants the sound to be approached. More European, I guess would be the right word. That scene is a mix of production, which is good sometimes, right? And, you know, field recordings of boats which have some variance to them, right? And then Foley. So it's just a matter of making, so all the spitting, clanking, that's all, you know, Foley recordings, you know, that are performed to the scene to give you some sort of arc. And then the production often has an energy that's just like you can't really replace because it's just so weirdly good, right? And then, you know, the sound effects of the boat doing its thing. It's really just this sort of dance of trying to find a way to like sustain it over that amount of time, and handing off and then going around again, you know, that sort of thing. So.
It's a tricky dance for sure, and it works really well in this film.
Yeah, that motor almost starts to develop a personality as the scene goes on. It's like probably a longer scene of that type than you would normally have.
Exactly.
You would have cut out by a certain point.
Exactly.
So another sound moment, we're in a memory, and he's seeing his mother kind of out of focus, and she's just opening her mouth, and we're hearing this sound that is a non-human sound.
Uh-huh.
And then we slowly start to realize that it's a crow from his present day that's poking into his memory. But that has to be planned out in production. Like, no?
Absolutely not.
So how did you time out her mouth and like the actresses to do that?
Well, I'm the exact order of events. I'm not even going to pretend that I remember what they are, but I know what happened was there was a conversation during the picture edit that involved the picture editor, the picture assistant, so Luke and Max and myself and Ari, and I forget even who it was. Somebody came up with this idea of, wait, we're playing the weird bird sound in the later scene, and then I think it was Max. It was one of us decided, oh, what if we lined it up with her mouth? And then someone else said, well, what if that was actually her making the sound? And then we took out her production. And then Zoe Lister-Jones, who plays the character, came to the studio, and we did on the stage, me and Ari and her together, and Luke, and we played it for her. Just if I recall, Ari had this sort of idea of like, well, what if she's not okay with it? Like, what if should we play it for her? So we played it for her, and she immediately loved it. And so then we left it. But it was.
So it was a scripted line originally that she was yelling something.
I should go back and look at the production. But yeah, I mean, there's production of her doing. I don't. Ari could correct me, but I don't remember it being it wasn't a thing. It was this weird idea that sort of emerged from all of us just bouncing ideas off each other, and then once we saw it was working, there was a little insecurity for a while because during some friends and family screenings, that was definitely a question we would ask some people, like, what about that thing? Did you understand it, or did you? Yeah, so my recollection, it was totally a weird collaborative organic thing that just sort of evolved over the course of the picture edit. But
well, it worked. You faked me out. I assumed that was planned well in advance.
Not at all. And then when Zoe came in to do her ADR, she's an incredible voice actor herself, so she did a sort of like riff on it, which then there's a little bit of her mimicking the bird.
Oh, okay.
To sort of just help sort of cement it, but the production's not in there at all. So
that's awesome.
After the fact.
That's a cool story. I love those things when they happen. So the very beginning of the film, we start in darkness. There's weird like flashes of light happening, and the sound plays a major role in the first 45 seconds, a minute and a half. I'm not sure how long that scene is.
Probably a minute, yeah. Before we come through the light and into the delivery room.
So was the sound done first or the picture done first on that scene? Because it's quite abstract pictures.
Well, but that's not. There's visual effects involved, but that's footage. Yeah, so picture came first. Yeah, really.
So you were matching to that.
Yeah,
and just figuring it out as you go. Like,
well, but to your point earlier, that's really the process of picture and the placeholders happening in, or not even placeholders, the final sound design. Much of that is stuff that Max and Luke did in the Avid, right? And then Ari and I had endless go-rounds about like very particular elements of it, right? So I would send them sounds that I thought would work, little mock-ups of certain areas, and then we started doing all these. Ari was obsessed with this idea of like as the liquid is passing over your ears. So he would come to the studio, he would just give me these examples. He'd be like, when it goes like this, and he would just take his hands and like fluff them past his ears really hard. He's like, when you do that thing, like when your ears are like not quite functioning, and and so he was obsessed with this sound being a very particular thing. So I sent them a whole bunch of stuff which they cut in, and then we just did a billion wild Foley sounds. So it's the usual stuff like vegetables and goopy substances. I would take lavs and wrap them in tape, or take a hydrophone and put it inside of. We just did everything we could think of, pumpkins and yogurt and dog food and Jello and like and in different size containers, and like just to try to create some sort of thing. So we just did hundreds of recordings of like, which is probably plays as 45 frames in that entire section, right. But just through the method part of it, of just like giving them endless ideas of like, or just taking mics and abusing them, just taking an old mic and just like hitting it, dropping it, trying to make it crackle, and to give them the raw material, to try to find something that they reacted to. So that section, 90% of that is the stuff that they cut in the Avid, and then once they came to the mix, then we, the low frequency is sort of like which in a way is an overarching thing, hopefully for mixes. It's like the low frequency and the high frequency is sometimes the hardest stuff, right? So bringing in more succinct, LFE and low frequency stuff, and then the really, really super high frequencies, really dialing in those things in a very particular way that gave Ari the feeling he was looking for. But the core of it was all put in the Avid.
But based on stuff you've
based on stuff that I sent for them, exactly.
Yeah. So what was the schedule like on this show? Like, because there's
we did say it feels kind of like 5
movies
distinct movies. Yeah. And it is, the runtime is 3 hours.
Almost just under 3 hours.
3.5 hours.
Yeah. Just under 3 hours.
But the credits, the size of the crew is very small.
Yeah.
Like it's like 3, yourself, I think 2 or 3 editors and a Foley team, basically.
It's very small, yeah, exactly. But we agreed at the beginning to approach it that way. That style doesn't fit every film, but it's definitely one of my favorite approaches where, and Ari and I talked about that a lot at the beginning, it's the idea is to sort of bring all the big budget ways of making movies that we know we can do with lots of crew and lots of people and, enough time, but then the really intimate, like, bespoke handheld process of you're doing this very specific thing with one or two people, really. It's like the director and the picture editor ultimately. And there's, of course, then there's the expanding ring of other people who are essential. But really, it comes down to you and the director, and in this case, if the picture editor is very close to the collaboration, which Luke is very much so with Ari, it's really the two or three of you, right, doing this thing. And so I built the schedule specifically that way from the beginning, where, and this was all very, very repeatedly explained so that we all understood what we were doing, but we just mixed for a really long time. A friend actually likes to keep track of the hours that the directors at the mix, and without naming any names, the person he was working with had been at the mix for something like 28 hours, and this was a feature final mix, right? And because they have a long-term relationship, and I've been in situations like that too, like it all came out great, right? But the director was literally in the studio for 28 hours total for a feature-length film, right? I really should have calculated from the beginning, but I realized with Ari, it was well into the high 400s. Like it was in final mix. We spent a lot of time mixing, just slowly going through everything over and over and over again. And that's the only way for me that I thought we could really get to a place where the movie felt big, but also very, very, everything was crafted very specifically with him. So that was all very, very intentional.
So is this on a pre-mix stage or on a final mix? Like,
we would do. Our rooms are set up for pre-mixing bigger movies or finaling smaller movies. So, I mean, a small stage, but an Atmos, Meyer speaker stage, like where you final a movie, but not on a huge lot like in LA or anything like that.
Yeah.
But then we went to bigger rooms to do final tweaks with producers and playbacks and stuff like that. But that's the great thing about having a really, I actually prefer like a really tight, proportional, very well-tuned, smaller room, because you can hear reflections and reverbs and stuff more accurately. And then if it translates well enough, then when you go to a bigger room, you have the experience of being in a bigger space, but it sounds the same, except you can actually get a little more detail in the smaller. So I actually prefer that, to spend more time in a really good sounding, tighter, smaller sounding studio, that then you take it to a bigger room and go back. And the key is to go back and forth. That's why temp mixes that's the real value of temp mixes. You do it in the studio, then you go watch it in a 500-seat theater, then come back to the studio. That endless go around is essential.
And you're handling everything on the faders, right?
Oh yeah. And it's fun. I love mixing with other people, but certain movies, it's if you know what you want, the fastest route is to do it yourself.
So when you got to we mentioned earlier, this fantastical kind of animated, did you approach the sound design of that sequence differently?
Not differently, but for me, and I tend towards this in general, but definitely in this movie, for me, the key thing was to find these ways to sort of do these little sonic magic tricks where you don't, because Ari, the writing in that center section, everyone has their favorite parts of the movie, those who like it, right? But that center section with the animation to me is my favorite, because it feels so metaphysical and just like, it's just, the depth of it is so understated, but the writing is so brilliant. You don't even know, you're not sure what you're watching, but you're engaged. You don't know who this person is exactly, or why they're even telling you the story, but you're listening like that. All those levels, to Ari's credit, are so well done. So for me, the sound was important that have that same feeling where you want the viewer to arrive at a place, but they don't know how they got there. And that was a key element of it. But all of those transitions, I was trying to do that in every place, right? So when he's in the back of the car and they've given him the drugs, the drugs to smoke, the whole goal was I wanted to get, there's the obvious nature of like someone having a tripping on drugs, but then what was really important to me was for us to arrive, because then at the end of that scene, you arrive on the cruise ship with his mother, and that transition is completely seamless. It's essentially like it's a 6-minute pre-lap, basically, right? So you when you get on the boat, there is no sound change. you haven't, but yet you've been in this drug trip for several minutes. So how is it that the ambience and the sound design and all the sound of the voices and everything sound the way they sound and appropriate in the car, but then you get on the boat and they're still appropriate? So that blurring and that like super long pre-lap was really important to me, so that we get there and we don't know how we've arrived. And the animation section was the same way. It was like I wanted every transition to feel like it's been coming for so long that when the cut arrives, you don't even know how you arrived there because you've been hearing this thing that makes sense in the other scene, which is completely, different from where you are now, but where you are also seems to make sense. So I was really trying to make that, to follow the lead of like the script of doing this thing where everything is sort of upside down, but has been already happening in this weird antithetical way.
That's just really like psychologically profound that you're able to echo that concept with the soundtrack.
It's the fun of it.
It's just really smart. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for inviting us in and having this talk with us. It's, as I mentioned in the intro, it's just an endlessly inventive film that there's so many things that just happened where I was like, I did not expect that to happen. Where is this going now? What's going on? But in a way that I felt, at least, it invited you along with it instead of alienating you.
That's great. Well, and great to have you in person at the studio too. It's fun.
Awesome.
Thanks so much.
Paul is the best. He's always a joy to speak with. I hope we get to talk to him again in the future. It was great of him to welcome us into his studio and be an excellent host. This episode was volunteer edited by Kyle Bailey. Kyle is a violinist and sound designer for games. He wants to encourage those who are able to offer internships to upcoming audio professionals. It can truly change someone's life. What a great message, Kyle. And I agree, it can be an incredibly rewarding experience for both the mentor and the mentee. Thanks so much for your detailed and excellent work, Kyle. He will be getting a copy of the excellent SFX library, Sonic Springs, from Katrine Amsler. Listeners should make sure they have a copy in their own library because it's really great. On behalf of Teresa and Paul, thanks for listening to Tonebenders. Please help us out by sharing on social media. I cannot tell you how much that means to us. Okay, talk to you soon.
Tonebenders is produced by Timothy Muirhead, Renee Coronado, and Teresa Morrow. Theme music is by Mark Strait. Send your emails to info@tonebenderspodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter via @thetonebenders and join Tonebenders Podcast on Facebook. Support this podcast. You can use our links when you shop at Amazon or B&H, or leave us a tip. Just go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click the support button. Thanks for listening.
Are you looking for more audio-related podcasts to listen to? Tonebenders is part of the Audio Podcast Alliance, featuring a hand-picked selection of the very best podcasts about sound. Be sure to hear the latest episodes from our friends in the community at audiopodcast.org.